Thinking and Politics of the Poor, the book under discussion today. And he's currently a fellow at the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, where he's working on his second monograph, A History of the Indian Left and Political Thought in Modern India. Professor Sheikh will present and talk about his book for the first half of the talk, and be followed by comments from Harsha Raghunandan and Meenakshi, who are graduate students in the Department of History here, working on environmental histories and histories of and material histories of South Asia. So thank you, Junaid.
And it's such a pleasure to be here in this room again after 9 years. This place was really formative for a substantial and important part of the book, which is chapter 2, was conceived and I started working on it here. So thank you for having me. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about just the most important question that the book discusses, which is what is the history of caste in Bombay City? I can tell you stories about how I came to this question maybe a little later. But what is the history of caste in Bombay City? And the thesis of the book is that industrial capitalism in Bombay City attached itself to caste, and by attaching itself to caste, it also started leeching on caste. Right? So if you want to start an industry in a place like Bombay, one of the things you need is capital. In order to get capital in a period in the 19th and 20th century, early part of the 20th century, when you don't have nationalized banks to go and borrow from, what do? You raise capital from your caste and kinship network. Right? Now, after you have recruited, you've gotten capital, you have imported machinery from England, you need laborers, you need workers, and you need cheap workers who you can pay less. So for that, again, the owners recruited the jobbers who then went to their villages and recruited workers through their caste and kinship network, brought them to the city. If you needed 200 workers, they made sure that you get 2,000 so that you can pay them less. But the question is then, where do you house them? For that too, caste became important to recruiting, disciplining, and housing workers. So caste generally is seen as a rural phenomenon in sociological studies of South Asia in the 20th century. And so the argument is, the question is, for instance, the famous sociologist M.N. Srinivas had made a point that there is not enough material to study caste in the city. Why is that? What happens to caste? It's there, but what happens? Why can't you see it? And the argument of the book is that it's hiding in plain sight. And the two sites that I explore are the built environment and language. Right? And the chapters of the book then substantiate this. And I'll give you just a little brief introduction to all these chapters, just a little introduction. So housing, question and caste, of course, going back to how workers are recruited and then disciplined and then housed. So housing was important. Most of the workers lived in slums because you're paying them less. They didn't have money to live in tenements, etc. Right? Marxism, language. Right? Once you have workers, then there's workers' politics. Marxism became important in the 1920s. So the history of Marxism and the left, and of course, caste movement, which is also developing around the same time. So chapter 2 traces some of that intersection. Now you have workers, you have slums. You also, of course, the question is of urban planning. Right? Slums are seen as an eyesore, and planning is the way to then deal with slums. So chapter 3 then deals with the question of urban planning towards the end of the colonial period and then in the post-colonial period. But it's in these slums that plans and then the government wants to get rid of. It's in these slums that intellectuals and writers grow up, who write then form a field of literature called Dalit literature. Right? So the last 2 chapters then deal with the first lineage of intellectual lineage of Dalit literature, and then how Dalit literature itself is a field of power in which slums are a place, or not just of depiction and representation, but also a site where a lot of politics is going on. I'll come to that in just a little bit. So, as I was saying, caste was important to the growth of the city. Caste, along with class, of course, was important to the growth of the city in the 19th and 20th century. And most Dalits have low-paying jobs in the textile industry, are either working on construction sites or docks. My entry really into this project was through dock. I applied to graduate schools thinking that I'll work on dock workers. And most of the dock workers were really Dalits. So it's through that I then got interested in this. Right? And in the sanitation department, of course, of the municipal corporation. So one of the features of the labor market, which historian Maurice D. Morris, economic historian, who had published in most of his work in the 50s and 60s. And in the 60s, he had made a point that Bombay's industries required minimally trained labor that you can recruit at a particular moment when there is a big order and then you fulfill that order, who can work for some time, but you can also dispose them off easily. Right? That was the feature of the labor market in Bombay in the 19th and the 20th century. And it's, or the early part of the 20th century. And it's to guard against that trade unions came up. Because mill owners were disposing off labor, dismissing labor so easily. So it's to guard against that trade unions came in. So this easily disposable, cheap labor, low-paid labor was a feature of economy in Bombay, in South Asia broadly, in some ways continues to be. And this labor then had to be housed somewhere. Right? In most places in Bombay, because they either couldn't afford or were not allowed to, they lived in structures like these. So these, in the background are the Bombay Improvement Trust tenements. And in the foreground are some of the houses. So there are these. Right? And then there are structures like these. These are from A.R. Burnethurst's 1925 study of labor and housing in Bombay. So housing is the book begins, the substantive chapters begin with housing. And paucity of, the housing question is really the paucity of affordable housing. It's not the lack of housing in the city, but it's really paucity of affordable housing. There are many tenements that were empty at various moments in Bombay. There are many houses, structures that were empty at various moments. The point is really the affordability of those structures. Right? And that's also where then the state got involved and intervened and had to then build the City of Bombay Improvement Trust, build certain tenements. The Bombay Development Departments built certain tenements. But the urban poor, who were the intended target audience, so to speak, of these tenements, they could rarely afford these places, these rooms in what are called chawls. The Bombay Improvement Trust and the BDD, which this can be documented a lot easily, they paid attention to caste when they were allotting tenements. There was a survey that went out, and that survey asked people to identify their caste. So in assigning tenements, in assigning rooms or assigning buildings, particular buildings in a complex of, let's say, 15 or 20 buildings, a particular building was assigned to Dalits or one or two buildings. Right? And it's in these tenements that you see the emergence of some of the Dalit leadership and urban leadership, Dalit leadership in Bombay city, including people like Ambedkar, who himself migrated to, his family that is migrated to the city in 1903, who stayed in the BIT chawls, lived there until the 1920s, the family. Right? And then all the way up to the 1970s, where some of the important leaders of the Dalit Panther movement, inspired by the Black Panther movement, they also grew up in some of these tenements. And then, of course, these tenements were just a minuscule of the sum total of housing in Bombay. Many of the workers had to rent a tenement from a private landlord, and they considered caste too. And they considered caste in a way in the sense that Dalits were not given housing in many tenements because of their caste. A feature of workers' politics in Bombay, labor politics in Bombay, is that they never, until the 1930s and into the 1940s really, the demand really was for higher wages and bonus wages. Right? The workers, they're not demanding housing, which is an interesting feature. And Frank Conlon, who used to be a historian at University of Washington, and Radha Kumar, another historian, they made a case that the workers wanted higher wages because they wanted to then pass some of that along to their family members in the countryside, right? Which is why they wanted higher wages, but not necessarily a tenement to stay, a house to stay in. So that's why housing was not an important demand of the workers. But the Dalit movement, of course, demanded housing from very early on. So this is the social formation in Bombay in which capitalism, class, and caste are important features. Now, the question is, now from the 1920s onwards, is how to transform this formation. And the solution that people are come up with is they all invoke a revolution. This is, of course, the time after the Russian Revolution, which has inspired many people. And from the 1920s, leaders, activists, writers, even urban planners, there is a rhetoric. Everybody is invoking revolution. Revolution may mean different things to different people, but they're all invoking the term revolution. Right? They all want an alternative. Right? They all are using revolution in order to not just to rapidly transform the social formation and the spatial formation, particularly with urban planners. Right? But they're also using the term revolution in order to understand this formation itself. What is this formation of capitalism, class hierarchy that we need to change, right, through a revolution? So in the words of Enzo Traverso, it's an interpretive lever too. So revolution is you overcome your limitations and imagine a future. So for somebody like Ambedkar in the 1930s, annihilation of caste was a revolution that would transform Indian society. Marxists believed that a political revolution would lead to socialism. For urban planners, it meant transformation of the city, the spatial organization of the city, make it more conducive to the circulation of capital. And for the Dalit Panthers movement, and of which some of the members of the Dalit Panthers movement were Dalit writers, it meant overcoming a social and cultural hierarchy or hierarchies. This, of course, revolution was an important theme, important rhetoric of the 20th century, starting from the 1920s particularly, right? And even now continues to be. I'll come to that in just a little. So this, now that I've introduced the theme of revolution, some of the important actors who were invoking the term revolution were, of course, the Marxists. So the question really of chapter 2 is, what was revolution in theory and what was it in practice? One of the ways in which I connect the history of Marxism in Bombay to the history of the Dalit Panther movement later on is through this term lumpen proletariat, and that chapter 2 explores the category of lumpen proletariat. I'll say a little bit more on this category. For Bombay Marxists, lumpen proletariat was a source of anxiety. But for the Dalit writers and leaders of the Dalit Panther movement, the lumpen proletariat are, they look at them with hopefulness. They humanize them in their literature. So when Indian Marxists now are reading whatever little pamphlets that they can read, whatever pamphlets are coming into Bombay. There's not much that is arriving in Bombay because of a surveillance apparatus. But whatever is coming to Bombay and what they're reading, this has to address the social formation of which they are a part. Right? This has to say something about Indian capitalism. This has to say something about class hierarchy, of course. And it also has to say something about caste, right? Because if political revolution is going to then eventually lead into a social revolution. So it has to address that. So a political revolution, of course, would be led by the vanguard of intellectuals and the proletariat. Will that revolution, political revolution, which is a class for them, class is the important category, will that revolution also append caste hierarchy? And in order to do that, in order to then speak to Indian Marxists, other Indian Marxist activist workers, they had to then therefore get into the business of translation. Right? Translating Marx and Marxist sociological categories to reflect on Bombay or India's industry, India's economy, etc. And also, then the terms that you use in order to appeal to workers who are not proficient in English, right? In the 1920s, the language of the labor movement was really mostly a language of, when it comes to reading, was mostly English. But now when you're going and standing in front of mill gates to mobilize workers, of course, that language would be Marathi. And then if you're wanting workers to get involved in this politics, you have to read something in Marathi or listen to something in Marathi. So these Marxist categories have to be translated now in Marathi. So the chapter 2 looks at this politics of translation. So the Marxist theory of caste was important. They have to say something about caste, right? Because it's a feature of this social formation and Indian social hierarchy. So the implicit theory of caste that they, and implicit and explicit, as I'll show you, is that capitalism will weaken caste, right? Will desiccate caste. Right? And then because it is now caste has weakened because of capitalism, colonial capitalism, now you can then aggregate workers who have now very minimal caste feelings, and then mobilize them into a class. And then over a period of time, caste will be eventually negated. That's their theory. Right? So Roy, for instance, said caste was no longer a living social factor. R.P. Dutt said caste will be overcome by modern industry and political democracy. But as I'm saying, the theory is out of sync with practice because capitalism is in fact attaching to caste, finding nourishment in caste. Right? Capitalism finds an inbuilt hierarchy in the caste system. Why would they bother to get rid of that hierarchy? Right? In fact, use it as much as you can, and which is what they do. So some of the first communists, like some people like Shripad Amrit Dange, attempt to explain caste because they can't leave caste unaddressed. So he starts this very early on from 1922, where he's combining history and mythology to imagine a commune in Indian antiquity. Right? He has to make the case for the relevance of Marxism in India. Right? How do you make a case for Marxism in India is by imagining that a commune that already existed. Right? The point he's trying to make is that Marxism, communism is not foreign to India because we had a commune like that in Indian antiquity. That commune was for him a paradise. And then it's from there that things then started unraveling when Indian antiquity then gave way to feudalism. Right? One of the heroes of Dange, and actually his most important hero, I mean, one can argue was probably not Marx, actually, it was Tilak. Right? He was reading Marx through Tilak, really. And And Tilak had imagined this commune or Aryan antiquity beginning in 4500 BC, which any historian of ancient India will say will not agree with this periodization. Ravilath Hopper, for instance, says it's around 1500 BC. Right? And Dange is now pushing it back further because this is what Tilak wanted to do. And he finds Aryan presence in India in between 4000 and 6000 BCE. And this commune then devolved over a period of time. And its end, of course, would be socialism and communism. If the Leninist line were to be followed, the state will wither away and communism be formed. And this path from then Aryan commune to socialism, and eventually with socialism, caste would be vanquished. Capitalism and socialism will vanquish caste. Right? So capitalism has had an important role to play in getting rid of caste. And Dange had no compunctions in admitting that he was an economic determinist. Right? And he also had this lovely quote that I found on. There's a fascination among Indian Marxists for Bhagavad-Gita. Right? Even as late as 1983, there is a pamphlet that I found on Marxism and the Bhagavad-Gita. And this is what Dange says. I won't read the quote. So caste basically came into existence to satisfy the economic needs of society. Of course, there is an alternate lineage on caste, on thinking about caste among Indian intellectuals, not just in Western India, in other parts of India too. But in Western India, it's Jyotirao Phule and B.R. Ambedkar. And they had posited, their theory was that caste was invented by the Brahmins, who were the descendants of Aryan invaders, who conquered and usurped property and then devised caste. Right? This theory, of course, Dange ends up ignoring, and many Bombay Marxists end up ignoring. Right? According to him, this view underestimated Ambedkar also in his Caste in India is disagreeing with this division of labor thesis on caste. So now if the Marxists are believing, or the theory is, that caste is about to become irrelevant, if not already irrelevant, because capitalism has weakened it. Then if there are mobilization along caste lines, particularly the anti-Brahmin movement or the non-Brahmin movement, and later on with the Dalit movement in the 1920s and 30s, then any mobilization of that is, any assertion of that identity is seen as unpatriotic and narrow. Then why are people attached to caste? Right? When it's about to become irrelevant. They believe that they are really petty bourgeois, the people who are agreeing to this view. They really want a share in the spoils of colonialism. So Dange, from very early on, blamed the anti-Brahmin politics. And there was in the Socialist, there was a editorial in which he had written. Right? And in that he blames the anti-Brahmin politics for not recognizing the importance of caste, the universality of caste. Similarly, there were members of the non-Brahmin, anti-Brahmin movement who were members of the Communist Party. And he had a critique of them as for creating strong anti-Brahmin feelings. Arjun Alve and Govind Kasle. And they, on their part, call some of the communist Brahmins, call them communist Brahmins. The communists at this time were in jail, and they're calling them reactionary. That is, that any assertion of Dalit identity is artificial and ultimately reactionary. So the socialist revolution then devolved into caste acrimony. That's the point of that chapter. There are, of course, many Dalits who did become part of the communist movement. And then there are people like figures like these. There's More, then there is somebody called E. Palan or Lingam, There's also a very fascinating Lascar by the name of Babu Karim. And in the book, you'll find some more stories on these people. These are people who had become involved in or had observed the labor movement in the 1920s. And that's how their curiosity about Marxism they were intrigued with Marxism, and then eventually they joined the Marxist movement. In fact, Palin ended up going to the University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow, and then came back to Bombay. Then the question now, of course, Marxism is becoming popular. It has to then mobilize workers. What are the workers going to read in Marathi, right? And some two publishing houses start doing that. I can talk a little bit more. But one, I think, important argument of that chapter is that when you're translating from English into Marathi, and somebody like Adhikari also knew German. One argument that the chapter makes is that the abstract categories or conceptual categories of Marxism, which is like use value, for instance, or value, they are translated in Sanskrit or Sanskritized Marathi. But the embodied categories like lumpen proletariat, which becomes important as I'll talk a little bit more about it. Mawali, for instance, lumpen proletariat is translated as Mawali. These are the embodied categories are translated in urban slang. Right? The point is that there is a hierarchy in language that you see working here. Right? Just a little bit about the lumpen proletariat. In Marxist thinking for Marx and Engels, they don't really spend too much time on the lumpen proletariat. In the 48 revolution, these lumpen proletariats, there is an anxiety about them in Marx and Engels. But then by 1950, Marx and Engels then appraise their understanding of the lumpen proletariat and think that they can become allies in a revolution. The 48 revolution failed, of course. And then when Marx publishes his Capital in the 1860s, that category comes up again, lumpen proletariat, as the reserve army of labor. That category has an important afterlife in Bombay and in Marathi. So lumpen proletariat, not only did they become Mawali and of course embody the threat of strike breakers, but in Dalit literature, it's taken up again, right? Mawali, lumpen proletariat is a figure that becomes important. Be it the vagabonds, the criminals, the sex workers. Mawali, of course, is the figure that can be, according to Dhasal, can be used in a revolution. So the chapter 3, of course, talks about urban planning. But the way in which I approach urban planning is through first, the entry point is then the works of Annabhau Sathe, who's a communist, part of the communist movement in the city, and who had started a cultural troupe in Bombay. In one of his plays, you see his Marxist thinking of this Annabhau Sathe. In one of his plays, he addresses the housing question. By the 1940s, he addresses the housing question. One of his plays, Silent Procession, a fantastic play actually. And hopefully it gets translated by somebody very soon, and you'll be able to read it. And this talks about housing practices in Bombay. He maps Marxist progression of socioeconomic development onto housing. Right? So for him, humans first started living in caves in the hills, then went on to huts, then started living in mud houses. And under capitalism, they have started living in tenements. So slums and hutments in slums, therefore, is a regression, according to him. It's a regression in the eyes of capitalists, but it's also a regression in the eyes of the workers. The Marxian anxiety of the lumpen proletariat, you can see that operating in Annabhau Sathe's writing too. And it's at this time, in the 40s and 50s, that the plan, now India has become independent, the plan for slum removal, slum demolition, urban planning has become important now. And the slums again are in the center of all this discussion of how Bombay should be organized. And the Bombay Municipal Corporation in the 1940s, early 1950s creates a legal architecture for slum clearance. And it's in these slums that many Dalit writers have grown up. So to start a field like literature, which is such a modernist enterprise, people coming together and saying, let's start literature, a field of literature. Let's start something called Dalit literature. Those discussions, the initial discussions start among college students and among certain intellectuals in a college started by Ambedkar called Siddharth College. But really, it's the people who take it forward are people who have grown up in the slums and who really don't have much formal education. Dasal and Bagul and all, they have not even studied until the 10th grade. They take the Dalit literature and this discussion forward. Right? There is, of course, an intellectual who ends up contributing to it, and this intellectual is Wankhede, who had come to the US to study here and works on African American literature and then goes back to Bombay and publishes certain things on African American literature. And one of the things that he's discussing with these emerging Dalit writers is that maybe we should look at social anthropology as a model to write literature. Social anthropology is open to the question of difference, addresses the question of difference. And maybe because Dalit literature will be different, of course, because of that, then maybe that social anthropology can be a model through which people can engage with Dalit literature. Right? And also, of course, social anthropology is important because now Dalits are converting from Hinduism to Buddhism, so they can create new myths now. But the road from social anthropology to literature, right, the realism of literature, right, that goes through slums. Right? Dalit writers have to then, they end up talking about, not have to, but they end up talking about slums, life in slums. And again, the lumpen proletariat, the build form of the city, casteism, violence, sex work, all this, they are important themes in Dalit literature. Right? But so Mawali is not just a strike breaker, but also a father struggling to feed his children. The sex worker is feeding her dependents. She has many relationships that are not transactional. An African ruffian who lives in Bombay slums now, he falls in love with a woman who asks for help, etc. These are some of the themes in which then, by charting their social relationship, they end up humanizing the lumpen proletariat. And sex work, of course, sex workers is an important figure for Dasal. For instance, in his poems, it signifies dominance over a person. For somebody like Dasal, right? It's a commodity also, the sex worker and the body of the sex worker. And because it's a commodity, there is fetishization. Right? By fetishization, it's the bizarre feeling of attraction, lust, fear, loathing. So sex work, prostitution, it becomes one of the metaphors of Dalit lives in the city, because it's in that way that, for instance, Dasal is invoking this 16-year-old sex worker to develop a new sense of self. Dalits should develop a new sense of self. And that way they can get some control over their body and over time and space. Right? A space, for instance, in the slum from which they've been getting evicted, etc. So Dasal is here expressing an ability to imagine something new, right? An alternate world which will be created through a revolution, which is why revolution is important to Dalit writers and to the Dalit Panther movement too. This revolution, of course, again, in practice, the way it worked out was very different. And this literary revolution, mostly male writers ended up getting recognition and awards, and sometimes a city apartment from the government. And the political revolution that the Panthers wanted, of course, that didn't pan out in practice, of course. And we can talk a little bit more about that maybe later on in the question and answers. But there is something tangible that comes out of all this, which is the Dalit Panther movement and its various factions. All of them raise the question of slum dwellers in Bombay City. And it's through some of those questions that slums in the city become durable. Durable is a term that I borrowed from Lisa Weinstein, who's a sociologist. Slums in the city become durable. Through political mobilization, they get some sort of arrangement for some slums to become durable. Eventually, of course, the Panthers movement fractures, the labor movement fractures and disappears by the 1980s. And it's in this context that neoliberalism gains a footing in Bombay. And along with that, of course, there is an informalization of the economy. Manufacturing shifts, big industries start shuttering down in Bombay from the 80s onwards. Some of that manufacturing shifts to slums. Right? So number of slums keep growing. And then the service industry also requires slum workers, which again live in slums. Right? So number of slums keep growing, even without big industries. Yeah. But that revolution, of course, the dream of a revolution is infectious, and it's some of the same from some of these same places you'll find Dalit intellectuals, writers who again evoke the term revolution and have also been recently jailed because of that. Right. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid. Harsha, would you like to sort of start us off with this?
Should we be seated here?
I think if you'll be seen on screen if you move to the what.
Okay.
Yes,
Are we allowed? Sorry?
How many minutes are we allowed?
Definitely.
Thank you all. Thank you for having us here today, and thank you, Professor Chen, for a wonderful presentation and a really lovely read. I'll keep my comments brief so as to open up discussion to the room at large. But I should say that there's so much to appreciate in the text, which I enjoyed reading twice over. Not least the problematizing of those abstract ideals of the urban form. One seemed to be inherently emancipatory in the thinking of figures like Ambedkar, as well as the elite Marxists of the city, and instead seeing these spaces as being conditioned by the disjuncture between an abstract form of urban idealism and politics as actually practiced in the city, which don't take social justice concerns into consideration. I also want to suggest that one of the great strengths of the book is its expansive use of Marathi language sources, testifying to the promise of regional language presses that Partha Chatterjee has reminded us of in his advocacy of what work after subaltern studies should look like. My sense was that we have a level of analysis in this book that we can't get out of using English language sources alone and state-centric sources with particular varieties of knowledge production that are centric to the state. And what I also really enjoyed about the text was its focus, particularly in the postcolonial period, of a moment of disillusionment that takes us past the Nehruvian moment that too many postcolonial histories center around. For a doctoral student such as myself, early in my career, today's text raises a number of questions and opens up avenues of investigation that I'm very excited about. One thing is clear throughout the text: the extent to which casteism pervades the epistemology and strategies of urban governance, political and economic. There's much discussion about the extent to which housing laws serve to exacerbate caste inequities in the city. There's much discussion about displacement and resettlement of Dalit communities in slums as the city suburbanizes beyond its colonial era core. I wondered if you could tell us more about policing and the strategies that go into policing, both at the level of recruitment and at the conceptual level, how administrative categories in English are translated in Marathi, where policing is concerned. We know that military recruitment in the colonial and post-colonial states was a heavily ethnicized affair. And I wonder how policing fit into this within the Bombay landscape. My second point relates to the nature of the post-independent state. Again, to take up Partha Chatterjee's contributions, the degree to which political society was served through mild forms of welfare redistribution helped establish the legitimacy of the post-colonial state in his argument. So I wonder if among the housing schemes that you focus on in your book, if they testify to that phenomenon that he describes, of there being mild welfare redistribution, cementing the legitimacy of the state, but not being meaningfully, materially redistributive. I then want to turn to Dalit Panthers themselves, who are discussed in great length throughout the text. In the work of other scholars of Indian literature, such as Vasudha Dalmia, we have a sense of who the writers are, who the printing presses are, but also who the readers are. So I wonder, particularly where the Dalit Panthers are concerned in the late 1960s, what does the readership for these poems and these plays look like? Where are they distributed? Are they also centered around Siddharth College, Ambedkar's institution, or do they extend well beyond it? And what is the relationship of Dalit Panther writers to readers outside of Bombay? Because I noticed that in your bibliography, some of the printing presses and publishing houses that publish Panther literature are located outside Bombay itself, in cities like Pune. So what is that institutional relationship like between these slum-dwelling writers and publishing houses outside the city? One of the other points that you raised that was brought up in the presentation as well was the degree to which caste and class were seen as temporal problems. To the extent that Dalit Panthers, particularly Nandiya Dasal, embrace conceptions of Marxism, are they also motivated by a sense of temporal idealism, or do they militate against that? And then in reading Nandiya's works again, one cannot help but make comparisons to strands of Afro-pessimist thinking that are contemporary at the time when he's writing, not least because of the name of the group, the Dalit Panthers, and the genealogies that they draw on. So do you see the Dalit Panthers as representing a variety of Indo-pessimism, perhaps? Indo-pessimism rather than some of the other genealogies that are ascribed to Dalit groups in the city as drawing from Bhakti movements that you write against. And finally, I want to discuss the question of intellectual compromise. Despite lacking faith in the state, Dalit Panther writers like Dasal willingly incorporated into a state-sanctioned canon of great Marathi writers by the 1980s. And Dasal himself joins the Shiv Sena despite the well-known record of the party's anti-Dalit activities. So to what degree does that, what's the nature of the intellectual compromise that goes on there among Dasal himself, as well as, of course, his supporters and his readers? Because in his wife, Malika Amar Sheikh's autobiography, one gets a sense of the anguish that she went through when he decided to join the Sena. So what does that mean for the wider movement as far as readers go, as well as writers? And finally, just two more points. I can't help but talk about Bombay without discussing cinema. What is the relationship between Dalit writers and cinema in the city? Because we know that in the wider Marathi literary landscape, there's been something of a relationship between writers and scripts. One thinks of P.K. Atre, founder of the Samyukta Maharashtra movement, writing scripts for movies, Vijay Tendulkar himself being a script writer. Did the Dalit Panthers or Dalit writers in general have any kind of sustained relationship with cinema? Were they kept out of it? I'd be keen to hear more. And finally, this largely, or in part, being a work of postcolonial historiography, what were the challenges you encountered archivally, given the uneven nature of the postcolonial archive, and what advice would you give to doctoral students working on a similar temporality? Thank you.
Great question. Should I answer that?
Let's have Meenakshi. If you want to sit down in the front, if you don't have to stand.
No, I can sit here again.
Thanks, Harsha, for raising a lot of interesting questions, and also thank you, Professor Sheikh, for that very engaging talk. And I read this book a few months ago first, and now listening to you talk as well, I'm very gripped by how the book, of course, brings together class, capital, and caste in the production of urban space in Bombay, particularly through the intersections of built environment and literature that you alluded to in the beginning of your presentation. And I guess my first comment or question is about this methodological attempt that I think we're all intrigued by, to bring together these two completely different kinds of archives. So on the one hand, an archive of housing schemes and planning and governance, and on the other, this rich body of Dalit literary texts that record very different kinds of experience of urban life. And I was wondering to begin with how you arrived at this intersection that you want to look at in this book. Did it rise organically out of the archives during the course of your research? Or perhaps was it a connection that you sought out? Maybe could you also talk a little bit more about writing these together into the narrative of the book? And another aspect of the book that you discussed during your presentation as well was how urban spaces and built environments figure very differently in planning projects as opposed to the literary texts, Marxist as well as later Dalit texts. And I wonder how you approach other spaces or experiences that do not lie in this intersection. So for example, were there spaces that figured more prominently in one archive and was absent in the other? And how might one go about historicizing that? So for instance, so this is more of an open-ended question. And the next point that I wanted to bring up was this politics of literary mediation. And while I was reading the book, I was reminded of this Dalit autobiography of Kallen Pokudan, who was an environmental activist, Dalit environmental activist in Kerala. And very famously, there was a Marxist autobiography of his, in the sense that he was not literate, so it was based on interviews conducted by certain Marxist authors and so on. And there was the controversy around how his Dalit identity was removed from him, and then he was portrayed in a very patronizing way. And later on, he wrote another autobiography and so on. So I was very intrigued by this process of mediation of the identity, particularly by Marxists for public consumption, through processes like translation, editing, and so on. And you refer to this in the section on the politics of the forward. Right. So, so I was wondering if you could talk more about that. And on a tangential note, were there also any articulations of the lived experiences by non-literate members of the community within the world of this book? And lastly, another part of the book that I was very struck by, which you also talked about in your presentation, were the poems, especially the self-poems about the body of the prostitute. And this literature, which used the experience of the Dalit woman, or almost appropriated, one could say, almost as a metonymic device for Dalit urban experience in Bombay. And on the other hand, there was this larger critique by Dalit writers that other kinds of literature appropriated and commodified Dalit experience for public consumption. So my question is, if in your research or in the text that you looked at, if there were any hints of an engagement with this contradiction, and if you could also—
Can you say just a little bit more on that one? Yeah, so so I was thinking about particularly the poem that you referred to here, where when you read it, you get the sense of course, it is a male, the poet who's writing this, and alluding to how the female body is being commodified and so on. At the same time, there's this critique of other Marxist or Marathi writers, for instance, who are also commodifying it in a different way. So where do the lines align? And finally, I also, in a related sense, want to draw attention to the question of gender. You referred to how
female Dalit writers talked about different kinds of themes. So for instance, death rituals and so on. So were there any noticeable, markedly different trends in how female Dalit writers wrote about the urban space as opposed to the writers that you prominently discuss in the book? So yeah, that's my comments, and thank you very much again for the wonderful talk.
Should I answer?
Yeah, you can respond to these, and I think there'll be a queue of questions from the room and on the screen as well. So you can respond. You don't have to respond to everything, but whatever you want.
These are great, really sharp questions, actually. Fantastic questions. Right? I mean, where do I start? But let me start from because both of you asked about method and some of the challenges of the archive, and that's one common question. So let me start with that. I mean, as you all know, as we all know, as scholars of 20th century South Asia, that after the 1940s, the archives start running dry, right? You don't get much that the richness that you would get, for instance, let's say the Bombay Municipal Corporation annual report, right? After the post-colonial period, I at least didn't have any access to that. I'm sure there is a report like that, but the Bombay Municipal Corporation doesn't have an archive. It has a record room, and not many people have been able to get access to a record room. And I certainly, as a scholar, would go back only occasionally, once in 2 years or once in a year for a month or so. Well, didn't manage to get into the record room and in the post-colonial period, right? That would have been a great source, for instance, right? Also, some discussions among Bombay municipal corporators, for instance, about what to do, about slums in particular areas, where to build housing, etc. I had no access to that. So then in the post-colonial period, then you have to start getting creative, right? Which is, I use whatever was there in the public domain, which is some of the urban plans that were published, right? There were these seminars on housing, etc., on slums that are there. Then there's some work by sociologists, for instance, on informal economy, that. But that's where I decidedly turned to Dalit literature then as an important thing to talk about. But I didn't want to use Dalit literature just as one archive and as evidence. If you're using Dalit literature, then in my mind, then I have to talk about Dalit literature as a field of literature itself, right? Which is why the attention to Dalit and a chapter on Dalit literature as a field of power, etc. What they're talking about. So talk about it in their own terms. Right. So in the post-colonial period, then, I mean, this is the solution I found, which is then turn to some of these other things. So use urban planning, document urban plans, then in conjunction with literature, right? Which goes back to the question that Meenakshi also had about this intersection. So now if I'm using urban plan, and an urban plan is talking about the built environment, and now I'm talking about the post-colonial period, right? And then there is literature, that is language, etc. Right? Then how do I talk of them together? And how do I then, if I'm talking of them together, and if I take a relationship, trace a relationship between them, can I also find it in the colonial period, and late colonial period? Right? That was one of the questions. And it's thankfully, I mean, I happened to read Bill Sewell's book. Bill Sewell is a sociologist, historical sociologist, historian really. But Bill Sewell has this book, and in which the last chapter of the book argues for a dialectical relationship between built environment and language. Right? So that formulation was very helpful for me. So then that dialectical relationship, the point is now then to take, and since I was in my evidence, I was finding that. And then I tried to trace that in the colonial period too, and I did find that relationship. Right? So both then using the built environment and the shaping of the built environment. Right? So that's why this book is about Bombay City and shaping of Bombay City, which many people have spoken about and discussed it through the shaping of the built environment. Right? But it's also a classic social history formulation where there is also people, a group of people. Right? So it's also about people, and then if it's about people, then it's about people's politics. If it's about people's politics, then it's also about people's language. Right? So, and in that way, then this relationship between the built environment and language, then I could do it through a study of Dalits, or mostly the urban poor. Right? So that was the way in which, through my the lack of archives that I've discovered as I was doing. I mean, I thought, well, what's there? You just go to Bombay. I used to work in Bombay as a journalist, so I thought, you just go to Bombay, go to the Bombay Municipal Corporation, and there'll be all these reports that I can look at. Now, that's as simple as that. When I discovered that it's not as simple as that. That in fact, you can't even access some of the things, most things in Bombay. And even scholars who have stayed in Bombay, there are very few actually who've really managed to look at some of this. Right? These are not easily available. Because of that, then I had to retoggle and then talk about this relationship between built environment and language through the 20th century. And thankfully, there was some scholars have already spoken about this relationship, including Sipa. So that's how I went about doing that. Right? Then Marathi language sources, yes, as Harsha was saying, absolutely. Marathi language sources were, again, when you're talking about groups like the urban poor or Dalits, right? You'll find reference, of course, in the archives, you'll find references on that. But then many things that were written by them were in the Marathi language, right? By the urban poor and by Dalit writers were in the Marathi language. So, it was important that I look at Marathi language, and I was lucky enough that I could read Marathi, and because I've grown up in that area, so I could read Marathi. I had to sharpen my Marathi, of course. Marathi is not my first language. So, like most people, I read Marathi along with 3 or 4 dictionaries and tried to translate those terms. Right? So Marathi language sources became important in order to do that. And because the Dalit movement was invested in literacy, and among the workers too, that you see that there is a rise in, who are not Dalits, there is a rise in literacy from the 1920s onwards. You see that in this public sphere, many people are targeting that as an audience. So there are many newspapers that were targeting workers. Many newspapers emerged in Bombay in the 1920s. And some of those became, because of that literacy, they also wrote certain things. So I discovered some wonderful plays written by workers themselves. Now these are not Dalit workers, but by workers themselves. And this is where the colonial archives becomes important. It was easier for me to access that in a colonial archive, because these are still plays from the 1920s and 30s, which the British had, of course, collected. Some of them they had banned, but they had a record of that. Right? They had a record of that in the Maharashtra State Archives, and very importantly, most conveniently in London too, in the British Library. So you use some of that there. And then, in that sense, the colonial archives also enabled some of this, actually. Because through the various process of sucking up things all over India, they kept some records. They collected pamphlets, certain plays, which I would find easily in the colonial archives than outside in any other library. In any other library, it was becoming difficult, actually. One of the libraries that I worked on is a wonderfully rich library called the Mumbai Marathi Granth Sangrahalaya. There's wonderful material there, but it's not as well organized. You can't find it that easily. So some of the stuff I benefited from. In fact, I was going to the colonial archive and looking at banned literature. Right? So where there's banned literature, proscribed literature, you'll find lots of stuff there. This is what I did with Marxist pamphlets. Right? Dalit readership and welfare and housing. One of the things that I discovered is that, of course, welfare and housing was an important part of that welfare. Many writers, what the government, the post-colonial Bombay government did was encourage many Dalits to apply to one of the schemes that had been started by the central government for housing Dalits. Right? It's called PWR 219. I think that's the scheme. Right? So you apply to that and you get some loan to house, etc., and then you can pay that loan over a period of 30 years. So, but there is a contradiction there. So you could get a room in a tenement through that. I mean, you could buy a house, you could get a house, you could get a tenement. But then you have a loan and you're tied to it. Right? So in this way, for instance, some of the sanitation workers got their houses through the scheme. But what happened is that they ended up reproducing that to workforce. Right? House is also a site of reproduction. Right? A tenement is a site for reproduction. So if you're getting a tenement and you're getting a loan to build a tenement, etc., which you'll eventually own after you repay the loan, you are well now, in order to live there, that job will pass from father to son. So if you were a sanitation worker, your son becomes a sanitation worker, etc. So welfare schemes worked in, they helped them get some people get some rooms in tenements, but ended up reproducing a labor force of sanitation workers, aside for reproduction of the labor force. The contradiction in which it operated. Then Dalit Panthers outside Bombay, I mean, one of the things just Dalit literature. Yeah, the readership of Dalit literature is actually, it's targeted at both. It's really targeted at Marathi literati, who they want to also read this, which is why they looked at social anthropology as a model in which the Marathi elite leadership will also engage with this. But also it circulated among Dalit themselves. Right? So on Ambedkar's death anniversary on December 6th, for instance, there'll be these stalls near his Chaitya Bhumi where he was cremated, etc. And people from all over Maharashtra would come, and then in these stalls you'll come and they'll buy some of these books, and that's how it circulated too. But also one of the target audiences was elite Marathi literati and readership, right? Who in fact take to it, right? So appreciate it. It's a way to go storming through the writing. Then Dalit Panthers outside Bombay, absolutely. One other important site in Maharashtra is Aurangabad, where Ambedkar had started another college called Milan College. And that's another site where there is an important Dalit movement. It's the Dalit intellectual formation, and that, of course, is another very important site for Dalit literature, and then also Dalit Panthers also had links with that. And of course, then Dalit Panthers, the idea itself catches fire. And then there are Dalit Panthers all over India, right? From Tamil Nadu to the other parts of India, Karnataka, Kerala. So that Dalit Panther becomes the name and the model, it catches fire, that idea. And it's still, I mean, even now, there will be Panthers being formed even now in different parts. And and you can trace connections between them. Dhasal and intellectual compromise, I mean, Dhasal, of course, was maybe not an intellectual compromise. Some of it may have been just also, I mean, there is an intellectual compromise too, but also some transactional relationship. Dhasal, when in the 1970s, when he starts with Dalit Panthers, also writes a poem praising Indira Gandhi during the emergency. And then later on, by the 1990s, has then joined the Shiv Sena. Also, he needs some of that money. I mean, there's, so it's also, I mean, intellectual compromise, but also I think there's this financial need and all that too. Right? So there's both, bit of both. To Meenakshi's some of the comments. So so one of the things that I do is that urban space, the space that is described in urban planning documents, and the space that is described in Dalit literature and Dalit writing. Obviously, it's very, the way they're talking about some of the same spaces is very different. And that, that adds to the drama of it also. Right? So the space of the urban plan, there's a discourse of planning, which is in this, get rid of the slum and we'll build something here and, build a bus stand, for instance, right? Or build some housing or build an industry, etc. Right? Or just get rid of all that industry and then push it all the way out of Bombay city. That's how they would talk about this urban space. Of course, the space of Dalit literature, what I found interesting was the way in which the urban planners were talking about the movement from South Bombay to North Bombay, right? Because the South Bombay area was congested. And from the way in which the planners were talking about that through suburbanization and slum removal, you saw that logic, the spatial logic in operation in Dalit literature too. So some of the stories, the slums are moving from, in some of the stories, are moving from South Central Bombay to Northern Bombay, which is what the planners were talking about. So that was but then they're describing what is happening in life in the slum is a very rich description of a depiction of life in the slums, right? Fictionalized accounts, of course, right? But the way in which they think about it, etc., write about it, the relationships that they trace, the characters that populate their stories, right? That was very different. So for me, that became a way to juxtapose and bring about some of the differences in these. And mediation of Dalit identity through Marxist writers. See, for instance, R.B. Murray's book was recently translated by Anupama Rao and Vandana Sonalkar. The way in which that book is written, and R.B. Murray was, of course, a Bombay communist, joins the Communist Party of India, but also is part or also maintains close connections with the Dalit movement, with the Ambedkarite movement. The way in which that book is written is also itself very interesting. So, for instance, the book was started by R.B. Murray himself, but he barely had written up to 1920s. And then his son starts writing it. And then the son starts portraying the father in a more Marxian light. Right? The son was also a member of the board of the Maharashtra Legislative Council and was representing the CPI there. Right? And then the father dies, and then the grandson completes this memoir. Right? And the grandson is, of course, part of the CPIM, but is also close to the Dalit Panthers, or was, had close ties with them. Right? Was also believed in politics of Dalit politics. Right? So when he finishes it, it becomes, then R.B. Murray comes across as somebody who is now interested, was a part of the Marxist movement, but believes in an independent, autonomous Dalit politics too. So, so that mediation of from just one text, you'll see that there are just very interesting, the way you write about somebody like R.B. Murray, who was an intellectual. He is educated, but he had not written much of his biography before he dies. But even with that, there is an interesting. Then gender or the contradiction of Dalit, absolutely. The way you described it, the term contradiction itself, there is a contradiction. In the way they talk about women, in the depiction of sex workers, for instance, right? In some ways, there is some of that depiction is it's designed to shock its readership, right? And its readership, of course, is upper caste, Marathi, and of course Dalits. So it's designed to shock them, right? But in the process, there is a titillation in some of the stories. Right? There is a voyeurism that when you're reading it, there is a sense of you feel that there is a design to invoke a sense of voyeurism in this, and therefore titillation. Right? And then of course those stories, and that becomes the corpus of Dalit literature and ends up getting awards, recognized and ends up getting awards. So yeah, so there is absolutely and Dalit women writers themselves have critiqued the male writers for this. Right? There's a strong.
It might be a good time to just see if there are questions online.
Sure.
There are a number of people listening in or others from the audience.
Yeah, sure.
Ellen has.
Ellen, go ahead. Yeah.
Are there questions online? If not, I can pose my question. Okay. Thank you so much for your talk and for your really wonderful book. I guess I have like three very broad questions, so take them in whatever direction you want to. The first would be thinking about the emergence of the social sciences in India and the relationship that that has to the conditions of intellectual production.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how the social science disciplines develop in Bombay specifically. So if you think of sociology with Getkar, with Koire, if you think history and how it becomes involved in like Gulamgiri to like Ambedkar's writings, in what ways do the social sciences kind of condition the intellectual labor of these Dalit writers between the colonial to the post-colonial period? The second question, I think that one of the main sort of contributions of your book is to bring together, on one hand, histories of capitalism in India with histories of caste in India, which really has been kept apart for quite some time. So I was wondering here if you could talk a bit more about how this Dalit Marxist writers were thinking about capitalism as a system, and whether I mean, there are different arguments about relationship between caste and class that have been made by different scholars. With this, and I was thinking about the sort of overarching argument that you made, which is that capitalism leaches onto caste and operates through that form of social differentiation. Would you say that that's a sort of argument that perhaps mirrors something that Jairus Banerjee would argue, or would you say that it's a different sort of, that caste is a distinct modality that deserves to be taken sort of on its own analytic terms? And the third question I have that, which really testifies to the richness of your book and your presentation, is I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your work in relation to the literature on the urban history of Bombay, and what is it about the urban configuration of Bombay specifically, or Western India more broadly, that leads to the emergence of anti-caste movements in the way that it did? Because the other side that one might think of in India would be South India, that takes on a very different trajectory. So in light of the growing literature on Bombay by scholars who have written about like slums in Bombay or Bombay cinema or like urban planning and different neighborhoods in Bombay, what is it exactly about the spatial configuration of that city that enable the forms of mobilization that you trace in your very important work?
No, those are very great and sharp questions. You may have to jog my memory about certain things, but about the emergence, social science, of course, in India comes up through the lineage of social sciences, social reform. Right, and when some of the social reformers are talking about caste, of course, they're wanting to reform certain caste practices, particularly untouchability, for instance. Right, so social, so some of the early sociologists came out of this lineage of social reform. Right, and interestingly, some of the first 2 or 3 PhDs in Bombay University are granted to candidates who worked on caste and particularly untouchables, right? So that's why social science, particularly sociology. Also, if you look at A.R. Burnett, whose images I showed, he was an economist, but he also in the labor market he saw that caste was working in the labor market, and there was a differentiation not just in recruitment but also in housing, right? So social science from the colonial period onwards had to be attentive to the question of caste, right? But they would address it through the modality of social reform and reforming certain practices. Right? This, by the post-colonial period, I mean, Ambedkar, of course, engaged with it, and Ambedkar's also had a critique of it, the way it worked, right? But by the post-colonial period, Dalit writers who are now reading, they are reading, and they're wonderful. I mean, some of them are wonderful intellectuals, and they're reading broadly and widely. They are now chafing against some of this reformist lineage of it, right? They want to take it into more. They want to take it into more radical directions, but they end up turning to social anthropology. So they. And using that as a model, in fact, to talk about Dalit lives, Dalit experiences in Western India and Bombay City, right? But using it for different purposes. I mean, the goal is a revolution in literature and outside the field of literature, right? So social science, there is an engagement. there is an understanding of its limitation. Right? And then there is at least at various historical movements, a desire to go beyond it. Right? So, which is why it's also the subtext, one of the subtexts is it's really from sociology to social anthropology, right? In the book. Because in the first chapter, I talk about sociology. And in the fourth chapter, there is social anthropology. Right? So there is that, you'll see there is that. Right? But also an engaged critique of that, of an engagement, but also a critique of sociology, of the social, broadly therefore social sciences at that time. The second question was about this, I don't know if Jairus Banerjee, in his work, he acknowledges caste, but I don't think he has focused too much on caste, or he's probably not really. I don't know, he may agree with it, right? But I think a person who will definitely may find more agreement with it will be somebody like Kobat Gandhi, actually. Kobat Gandhi was this Indian Maoist who recently came out of jail. And I was reading his biography recently. We published his jail memoirs he published. And in fact, he was active in Bombay, comes back to Bombay from London in 1972, around the same time that the Dalit Panthers are formed, and is active in that. So he's working with that. And I think somebody like that formation of the 1970s, a lot of the Dalit Panthers are inspired by Maoism and some of the Indian, the Naxalite movement. Right? So maybe they in fact, probably may find that there may be some resonance there. Right? Maybe, I'm not sure actually. But somebody like that, Kobat Gandhi, for instance, understands caste. He spent his life working with Dalits in Bombay city and then in the countryside. Right? I don't know about Banerjee, for instance. I'm not sure. He may not agree. Yeah, I'm not sure. And then the third one was
urban history of Bombay.
The third one. What is it specifically about the history of Bombay? It's maybe I'll get into triteness. I'll have a trite response to it, which I don't want to. But because of the history of migration and the history of educational institution, the history of caste, right? The anti-Brahmin movement, for instance, somebody like Jyotirao Phule is coming up in the 19th century there, right? And Jyotirao Phule, of course, is an inspiration for some of the later Dalit writers, including Ambedkar, Dalit movement, right? I think Bombay's, the history of migration, just the sheer number of publishing houses, or the ease in the technology of publishing, schools, etc., access to some certain schools. In Ambedkar's own words, maybe casteism that is not, in Bombay, which is not as trenchant as he found in the countryside. I think some of those, this history of that, is probably where in Bombay you see the rise of the Dalit movements in the 20th century. All of that combined. Right? So I think all of that has a part.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Fantastic presentation.
No.
I had a question which kind of sort of takes off from on a tangent from Kelvin's last question, which was I'm just wondering if you could place the landscape of Dalit literature that you presented an outline of here within a kind of broader terrain of literary modernism. Were there what sort of other works were being translated into Marathi during this period, apart from the communist literature that you highlighted? I'm thinking specifically of the late colonial period, the rise of the Progressive Artists, Progressive Writers Association more than the artists. In relation to Bombay, a figure like Manto, where the figure of the trickster seems to bear a lot of overlap with the figure of the Mawali.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And so what is the kind of wider literature being consumed by these writers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question, and comes back to something which I think I've not discussed it earlier. When in Marathi, some of the things that Dalit writers and then also the working class generally, some of the things that are translated into Marathi are figures like Gorky and their short stories, and Mother, for instance. Mother is translated from 1920s onwards, and almost everybody in South Asia has read Mother in translation. Some socialist realism, it is translated, and that's where many of the writers have cut their teeth, or at least some of the earlier inspirations is through socialist realism of the 1920s and 1930s. Right. Then the neo-realism of the 40s, late 40s, 50s is also where some of the writers have read that and have learned from, has used that as a model. Right. Then a couple of thoughts, and I'm missing the link to that actually. So I mean, apart from socialist realism and neo-realism of the 40s and 50s, the writers, of course, are also part of Manto, for instance, is an inspiration, because Manto is one of the first ones who was talking about a prostitute, for instance, a sex worker in the 1940s. And you see that figure come up again in Dalit literature in the 60s and 70s. Right? So they're and so then through somebody like Annabhau Sathe, who is a Marxist part of the movement, and then also close to IPTA, and Annabhau Sathe, for instance, is great friends with Raj Kapoor and Raj Kapoor's people who are around Raj Kapoor. Right? So that is another, of course, influence, which is where it comes back to the question on films that he was talking about. Films, and so they are. And then a figure like Shailendra, who is a lyricist and script writer and producer and director, who wrote that wonderful, wrote many songs, of course, but also directed that wonderful film called Tisri Kasam or something, if you remember. Figure like Shailendra, for instance, is a very important figure here, right? And bridges the gap, or not, there's not much of a gap, but then bridges this three fields, which is Indian cinema, the Dalit movement, and the Marxist movement. Right? Annabhau Sathe has written film scripts. Right? So there is that. And then some of the Dalit writers, this is a paper waiting to be written, and I hope somebody writes it, which is, I think, some of the things that Salim Javed films of 1970s are talking about are really borrowed from Namde Dasar. Right? You can see that they were in conversation. Right? I don't have evidence that they were talking to each other. I'm sure they were talking to each other, but I don't have evidence. Right? But the way in which Amitabh Bachchan is depicted and Bombay is depicted in 1970s cinema, right? You can see that there is a conversation that's going on between many people, including some of the Dalit writers.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But in a de-radicalized way.
In a de-radicalized, for radicalized. There is an anger, etc., etc. Right. Yeah. But you can see some of the same assumptions about. So, for instance, when in what's that film in which Diva, I think, in which Amitabh Bachchan is a dock worker, right? He's beating up in that very famous scene where he's sitting, on that bench or on that chair with where he's a dock worker and he's wearing the dress of a dock worker. He's beating up the Mawali, right? He's a dock worker and he's beating up the Mawali. So you see that. You can see some of that Marxist anxiety about the lumpen proletariat. You can see that in that film. Right? But you can also see that Salim Javed have borrowed from, or at least are in conversation with some of the debates that are happening around Dalit literature. Right? And there are some debates that go on around Dalit literature, how to craft it, what sort of anger should you, how angry should the character be, etc. Right? These are debates that are happening in the 60s and 70s. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think we're running out of time, but I just had some questions I really wanted to ask you.
Sure.
First of all, thank you very much for giving life to this amazing work. And I had two questions. The first one was, I mean, in the outset and in the introduction, you do mention that we think of caste as a very rural phenomenon, and this is a work to really demolish that myth. But one question that I had was, why do we still have that myth despite all these evidence, time and time that show that caste was very much baked into the urban landscape and linguistic practices? I mean, you do mention some reasons for why that was the case, but do you feel that this was like more of a coincidental kind of alignment of events, or do you feel like there was more of an intentional agency on part of some force to really hide that fact or maybe subjugate the fact? So that was my first question. And the second was, I was really struck by your chapter 2, and I mean, I was actually struck when you first wrote that paper in 2011, the translation of the Communist Manifesto, because I come from the part of the world where it's still dangerous to associate communist writings with marginalized populations, because the instant association you get with PRC and DPRK. So you did not,
absolutely.
not to say that these were sympathetic to those regimes, and therefore there's a lot of stigma against that, and it's very difficult for us to explore the literature. So I was wondering, one thing I really wondered was, is the process of domestication and translation of these Marxist concepts, was it very similar to other concepts as well, in that were they influenced by how these concepts are translated and domesticated in other regions and other languages, or even other countries? Because from this work, I only see what it was like for the Marathi audience. So I was wondering if there was any comparative exchanges.
I'm sure there will be. I mean, I haven't studied it, right? And it's also the limitation of my linguistic ability, etc. But I can I think, reasonably make a case that even when the Communist Manifesto would have gotten translated in Urdu, for instance, another language, I think even some of the abstract terms there would be very Persianized, I think. So I can see there may be a similarity, but now I'm not a scholar of Urdu or Persian really, so really can't make that claim. But I sense that there would be that, there is that, So you'll find some parallels there in the process of translation. I think in different languages too. I mean, I would love to see if how it gets translated in, let's say, Arabic, for instance, right, or Mandarin, right. But it would be interesting to see what sort of decisions they would do the translators make. But I mean, my linguistic ability is really very limited. So yeah, so there's one. Yeah, and the first question was also very interesting. But can you just jog my memory?
So how we still believe in this myth?
Yeah, that's a great word. I was going to use the word myth to answer that question again. It's a powerful myth of modernization. Right? That modernization will get rid of caste, and caste is therefore of antiquity, or at least feudalism, according to Marxists. Right? Caste is feudal. When you enter capitalism or the capitalist age, then of course you overcome feudalism, which means that you will overcome caste or have overcome caste. And socialism will definitely. So therefore, it's a myth of modernization, the process of modernization, which is a powerful one. Right? I mean, whether some people intentionally, intentionality, grand design, I mean, in historical work, you can't make that as your assumption, right? I mean, I feel, you'll have to show evidence about the contingent nature. If there is an intentionality, then you have to show that evidence of that, and which I think more than intentionality is just this shared myth of modernization, which makes it difficult even to then raise the question of caste. or if somebody is raising the question of caste, then to shut them or silence them and saying, but caste is redundant. So an argument against that is saying again, reiterating that caste is redundant.
For me, it was just fascinating because it's this myth that promotes people to keep moving to the cities and then build up and then keep reproducing the caste structure in the cities. Right?
In a different context. I mean, there is a change, of course. Right? Caste in the village and caste in the city will be different. Right? So there is that change, and historical work will have to account for that change. Right? But yeah, absolutely. There is caste is relevant in a changed form, but caste is relevant. Right? There was, I think you had a question there at the back. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering what you thought about like this is a lot of literary history. I was wondering what you thought about like more recent like economic history, like Branko Milonovic's book on like the comparison of post-colonial abilities to like overcome more, I guess. Like, never mind. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe later if you have,
No. I'm just. No, I don't know. I don't know how to actually phrase this question. So never mind.
I mean, maybe I could just pick up from that and also maybe frame this as the last question. So, and this sort of goes back to the original intention. When we look at the first set of sources on housing and industrial action, there's a very clear sense of what the economic structure of the city is.
Right.
And as we move to the second part, it turns to a focus on like construction of self, relationship between like communities. Right?
Yeah.
But it's also a period of deep structural change that's happening.
Right.
So I was wondering, is that something that when we did a graduate seminar on thinking about post-47 Indian history, the answer everyone seemed to suggest was we have to go back and do ethnography because that's the only way we can capture it. So is there a non-ethnographic way to understand this?
Right.
And tied to that, I know you have had a sort of long career as a crime reporter in Bombay.
Right.
And I was wondering,
not too long, but yeah.
So something that, it's sort of an experience of the city at street level, which is very similar, or at least works in the same world as this literature is sort of putting out. And there is a kind of representation of the unruly street in the public paper.
Right.
And how is that different from what is being produced in the literary sphere?
Yeah, well, those are two great questions again. And unfortunately, my experience as a crime journalist is not about the street because the crime journalist really has to go to the police station and then really to the courts, right? So my daily routine would be to go to the police station for a press conference, right? Have tea there, listen to what the gossip of the police inspectors, etc., police commissioner. And then from there, make your way to the sessions court and see what case has come up today and what was so collect a brief from there, a couple of sheets of paper from there. So it was really not of the streets, as the experience of as a crime journalist. Right. Though of course the police commissioner and the courts were talking about the streets, of course, right? But it's not going there and few times I did go there to the street, but after the fact, going to the street doesn't really help. I mean, unless it gives you a sense of the place and what would have happened. And at that time in Bombay, there were certain builders who were getting either shot at or killed, etc. But after the fact, I mean, there would be just a couple of police constables standing there and maybe some little mark there. And life would be absolutely normal, and the police constable, of course, are not allowed to say anything. And they themselves have not seen anything. So for that, for a narrative, you go back to the police commissioner. But it gave me a sense of, in doing historical work, how some of this would have been, when you're reading newspapers and when you're reading some of the crime investigation department reports, the Home Department files, it gave me some sort of an understanding of that, how they would have written those documents, right? And so yeah, it just gave me just a little bit of flavor of that. But how to write an alternate history without ethnography, that's a very, if you had documents, I mean, there are I think it's only if people who can find some of that access. There are so many rich stories on Bombay that you really can't get at. But I'm sure there is documentation. It's just that it's not organized. I mean, as you discovered in your book too, there's all these documents waiting somewhere in the corner. In Bombay, of course, Bombay is divided into wards, and these wards, of course, I'm sure are getting have this documentation at an everyday level. Somebody wanting a water connection, somebody wanting electricity connection, somebody talking about something else, all that. That is an archive that if somebody can lay their hands on, that is a rich story of Bombay, right? Or even the Bombay Municipal Corporation, as I was saying earlier, some of the debates that would have gone on into making this area, into changing this area, etc., right? Or imposing taxes. So that documentation is there, but unfortunately not available, right? If somebody can find some way of accessing that, right? Without that, I mean, you can only, of course, diligently look at newspaper reports, right? Newspaper reports from English, because they will have a reporter on the Bombay Municipal Corporation beat, or any municipal corporation, right? They would have had a reporter on, let's say, also the crime beat. So there is that daily stories that would have come up. So somebody would have to diligently sit and study all these stories in the English language and in the Marathi language, and see. And some of the Marathi language stories may be slightly different, I suspect, depending on access and on the readership. That would be one way to address some of this, right? In lieu of documents from the Bombay Municipal Corporation or the wards that I was talking about. I think this would be one way of doing it. Yeah. But that's fine. But again, you'll need many more. I mean, for historical work, you'll need many more things. And one way I did was one thing I ended up doing was, of course, also using some of Tata Institute of Social Sciences had some Journal of Social Welfare, etc. So some of their articles that they have published, many of them are on Bombay City, which is another interesting archive, again, waiting to be explored. I couldn't explore much, because, but that's another interesting archive. So through that, you can write if you don't want to do ethnography. But if you were to get access to some of those documents, it would be a fantastic Bombay story, which, I mean, it just goes to show that there's so much work left to be done on Bombay. And hopefully somebody ends up doing it. Or many more people end up doing it.
Junaid, thank you so much. And thank you to Harsha, Meenakshi, and Ryan and Amar for putting this together.